afternoon of March 28th, Senator Robert F. Kennedy of New York was flying to Lincoln, Nebraska. Behind him were 3 years in the United States Senate and 2 decades of active public life. Ahead of him was the toughest political fight of his career. 12 days earlier, in a time of national division and doubt, Robert Kennedy had decided to run for President of the United States. The question this afternoon was, what kind of reception would he receive in Nebraska? At the Lincoln Municipal Airport,
There he is.
he was greeted by nearly 1,000 friends. Many faces were new. Others were the faces of old friends with whom he had campaigned before. The ride down Cornhusker Highway took him to the Coliseum of the University of Nebraska. It was the first stop on a trip that would take him everywhere in the state.
I want to thank you very much for coming down here. This is my first visit to Nebraska in this primary. It's a very important and significant primary, and I've come here to...
This was not his first Nebraska primary. 8 years ago, he spoke here on behalf of his brother. Today, he would speak for himself.
Agriculture has given us too much, economically and spiritually, for us to assent to the decline of rural America. I don't think that's acceptable in Nebraska, and I don't think it's acceptable across the rest of the United States. You think of Nebraska. You think what you produced here. You think of all of the produce that comes out of the state of Nebraska. And yet I've been to the Delta area in Mississippi, and I've seen here in the same country our same people starving to death. I've seen them in eastern Kentucky without enough food, with milk once a month for children. That's not an exaggeration. That's for tens and tens of thousands of our fellow citizens here in the United States. Well, we know that there's something wrong. We know that there's something unacceptable, and we know that we can do something about it. I think there's something that we can do so that we provide men jobs. I think that we should get away from the welfare system and handing person a dole and provide them jobs and provide them work, and that's what I intend to do. I would have the federal government play a role in that, but secondly and most importantly, I'd give tax incentives to the private sector so that we bring the private enterprise system in an active way. Why not give tax incentives to the construction of the ghettos and into rural areas of unemployment, return to the control to the people themselves, and take it away from Washington? That's what I do. And I also intend to come to you, to us, for help, not just in electing the President of the United States, not just in obtaining the nomination, but running and governing this country so that we move in the right direction. And it is that spirit that I want to see return to the United States of America, and that is why I run for President of the United States.
The enthusiasm that surrounded Robert Kennedy in this spring of 1968 had never been seen in the long political history of Nebraska. But behind the crowd, behind the shouting and the handshaking, there were questions to be answered. It was true that there were only a few people who didn't know the face of Robert Kennedy, but it was also true that only a few people really knew him.
The first real home Bob had was up on Independence Road on Riverdale. But I never really knew him until he came to Bronxville. Just down the street in our neighborhood, they had a big house up at 294 Pondfield Road. Of course, they needed a big house, you know, they had a lot of kids. Mrs. Kennedy said they moved there to be near the public school. As a matter of fact, I met Bob walking to school. We'd go down Pondfield Road together, pick up 4 or 5 kids along the way. It was about a half a mile. Bob and I were in the 3rd, 4th, and 5th grades together. It was a good place to go to school. But things really went on at the Kennedy house. They were always doing something, always dressed up in something or other. On Sunday morning, though, there was no fooling around. He went to church. He made his first communion at the Church of St. Joseph's in Bronxville. But when church was over, back in the uniform he went. He loved football. Every weekend they'd go somewhere. Out to look at the animals at the farm or horseback riding in Central Park. They were always outside, especially when it was snowing, always outside. Or they'd go upstate to ski. Bob learned to ski up in New York. I'd say he learned about everything in New York. That's funny, you know, because when he ran for the Senate, some people said he never set foot in the place.
Delighted to be here. I'm delighted to I'm coming back home. When I was as I was touring upstate, I kept seeing these signs saying, "Go back home." Carpetbagger, go home, and now here I am. I even had problems when I was upstate. People couldn't understand my accent. I explained it was Glen Cove and Long Island. They don't know what you're saying. You say the cart went down the path, and they don't know what that means.
Jack and Joe would come home from college around June, and they'd leave their home in New York and go up to Cape or Hyannisport for a couple of months. The first thing Bob would do would be to prove to Jack he'd grown a lot during the winter. Jack used to sail a lot. He was a good sailor. He used to race against a fellow named Mr. Daly, and Daly used to beat him every time. But I remember Bob crewed for him one time, and he beat Mr. Daly. I don't think Jack really knew he was around until that day.
In mid-March 1938, the Kennedy family closed their home and sailed for Great Britain. It was a big moment for Bob.
This is my first trip to Europe, and I was very excited. I couldn't even sleep last night.
The Kennedy family brought to the American Embassy in London the same informality and spirit that had motivated their life at home. With his two older brothers away at college in the United States, Bob Kennedy was a young man growing up in the middle of 5 sisters. Bob attended the Gibbs School in London, but on weekends and holidays was home. Miss Luella Hennessy, the family nurse, remembers him.
I think probably Bobby could be singled out as the most thoughtful and considerate of all the Kennedy children. The rest of them were very pleasant and thoughtful to an extent, but I think Bobby was more loyal and considerate to strangers and to people outside the family than the rest of the children were. Bobby was very, very fond of his two older brothers, and whatever they said or did, it was positively okay with him. He loved the both of them, but I think more so with Jack, and Jack with Bobby. And Bobby and Jack would have great discussions and talks, and they'd walk around at the embassy grounds, and Bobby would be asking Jack so many different questions, and Jack would be very glad to answer them. And I think that maybe this gave Bobby a more matured mind than other youngsters his age, because he had such talks and discussions with Jack.
Kennedy humor would not permit one to take himself seriously, not even when he had written a book. But what Jack Kennedy had observed in his book was to come to pass. Within 1 year, His Majesty's government and all Europe would be at war. Before it ended, his older brother would be killed in action. The Kennedys came back to the United States in 1939, and Bob Kennedy was now old enough to go away to school. In his final year before college, he attended Milton Academy. Dean Arthur Hall remembers.
Well, he wouldn't be a fellow that you'd pick out of his class, as he did not win the poll for most likely to succeed. And his housemaster said, when asked does he possess personal qualities which tend to make him a natural leader, he said no. He admitted today that he might have been wrong. He was not outstandingly brilliant. He got good grades and graduated. He would have graduated decently if he hadn't gone into the war in his senior year, but he got his good results by working. He was not a naturally brilliant student who could just flick off the grades. He had to work. And I think he's always worked hard. He's always been full of industry and has worked for whatever he's gotten. And I remember it mostly on the football field, really, because I didn't have him in class. On the football field, you knew he was around because he's pretty active. He went at anything.
At Harvard, football was the world Bob Kennedy decided to conquer. Despite his size, he made the varsity at right end. He was best on the defense. But he never forgot catching this touchdown pass in the opening game of the '47 season. On November 22nd, 1947, playing with a fractured right leg and a cast, Bob earned his letter against Yale, something none of his brothers had done before him. At 22, Bob Kennedy finished Harvard undecided about his future, a young man with more questions than answers about his life. In 1948, he went to Israel. As a war correspondent, he began to find some answers. Living with Israeli troops, seeing war and death at close hand for the first time, seeing the River Jordan red with the blood of Jews and Arabs. He wrote his dispatches, and he came to a decision. Bob Kennedy decided his future lay in the affairs of men and nations. First, he must master the tools of logic and the law. These he acquired at the University of Virginia Law School, and after graduation, as a government attorney. Here, he got his first glimpse of the corruption, the rackets, the parasites of our national life. Following this job to Washington, he served first as assistant counsel for the Senate Investigating Committee.
They be invited to receive this information. I know of only one man to look into it and inquire.
Then moved up to chief counsel for the Democratic minority at the invitation of Senator McClellan.
I'd be very sympathetic if it wasn't for the fact that a majority of these people are in the central states.
In 1957, he was chief counsel to the subcommittee investigating improper activities in labor and management.
Naming the other names of the ones that
Here, he would make some lasting political friendships and a famous enemy. It was his first public service at his brother's side, but it would not be his last. In 1960, Jack Kennedy made his bid. Bob was there. So was his close friend, Dave Powers.
The day of the nomination, I was with the president every hour. Now, all that day, there were all kinds of talks of defections here and there, but all the time, right up until the time that we started to watch the first tally, the president checked with Bobby every hour. And now he spots his brother in the center of the Wyoming delegation, and they have 15. And the president had them down for 11, which would have only given him 759. And he said, Dave, this could be it. And just then Tracy McCracken grabbed the mic and said, Wyoming casts all 15 to next president of the United States, John F. Kennedy. And now we headed for the convention hall. And the first thing he did there, he came into the cottage, and Bobby was there, and he shook hands, put his arm around his shoulder, and they walked over to the corner of the room and had a quiet conversation for 5 minutes. And then you could see what they meant to each other. I don't know if anyone ever took a picture, but it would have been a great one.
I have felt that we should secure the best talent we could get for every position, regardless of party, regardless of any other factor. And I think that in every position, this test has been applied, and it's been applied in this case. To my satisfaction, I hope the satisfaction of the Senate and the people of this country.
Satisfaction with the new appointment was not unanimous. Even the most responsible newspapers expressed disappointment. But 4 years later, they admitted they were wrong. They would learn that the man who occupied the Attorney General's chair now was one who came early and stayed late. To Bob Kennedy, the law was the law. Once written, it had to be obeyed, or there would be chaos in the nation. On the night of May 22nd, 1961, a lawless mob surrounded the First Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama. They were bent on blood, preparing to burn the church. Inside, Martin Luther King and his followers looked to Washington for protection and waited. The Attorney General dispatched 150 U.S. Marshals directly to the scene.
And may I make another personal request on behalf of, I think, all of us, that we must be sure that we adhere absolutely to nonviolence.
They had staked their lives on the word of the Attorney General. They were not disappointed. But civil rights violations were only a part of the story. Bob Kennedy's job was to pursue the breakers of the federal law, and he pursued them regardless of their wealth, their political affiliations, or their names. But there was another breed of men. The men who had organized crime as a career. He went after them, too. His record against the hardcore underworld is remembered by a leading law enforcement officer.
He galvanized the Department of Justice into action to stop riots, crimes in the street, and the like. In terms of results, the convictions increased something like 1,000% during the time he was there. To a certain extent, there was a toughness, there's no question about it.
When Kennedy left this office, responsible men agreed it would never be the same. Men like Jack Miller, former head of the criminal division of the Justice Department.
You can talk to any knowledgeable person in the law enforcement field, and they will tell you that the period of time that Robert Kennedy was the Attorney General of the United States, the Department of Justice moved forward with more vigor and more justice and fairness in the law enforcement field than it ever has before or since. For too many years, people have ignored the police departments, have ignored investigative agencies, have ignored prosecutors' offices, have ignored the penal system. He recognizes more than most that the first obligation of government is the protection of its citizens. His record has demonstrated that fact. I think he will be known as a man who has probably one of the most important law enforcement officers of our generation. In sum, I don't think there's any question but what he will go down in history as one of the finest attorney generals this country's ever had.
What the nation was learning, the president already knew, that his brother was more than a cabinet member. He was a trusted advisor whose views were sought in every crisis. Neither of them could guess that in October of 1962, we would face our greatest crisis. On October 14th, 1962, aerial reconnaissance revealed the presence of Russian missiles in our own backyard. It would confront the president with his most delicate decision. One of his State Department advisors recalls the nature of the dilemma.
I think that what you have to remember about the Cuban Missile Crisis is that it was the first nuclear crisis the world has ever known. Consequently, its importance was not only that we survive and get through this crisis, but that, as President Kennedy used to say, that precedents that we set there would be the right ones for the future of history. We had to keep the long run in perspective.
For 13 days, the White House held the hopes of a frightened world. The president and his closest advisors worked into each night to salvage these hopes and the safety of this nation. Roger Hilsman was present at those fateful meetings as the State Department's Director of Intelligence and Research. He is a professor of government now at Columbia University.
Now, I think that of all the president's advisors, Robert Kennedy brought more wisdom to that table than any other. I think he, more than any other, had the whole perspective in mind constantly. And I think that we are all here today because this crisis was successfully resolved. And I think that Robert Kennedy deserves more credit than any other of President Kennedy's advisors for the fact that we're here alive today. I really believe this is profoundly true.
In 1962, Robert Kennedy was sent by the president on a world tour. In Japan, he told the truth about America to a group of anti-American leaders, while the whole nation listened and watched.
I appreciate your frankness.
皆さんの率直さを非常にアプリシエートし
And
ま
I
す
think you would expect the same from me.
もちろん私からもその同じ率直さを期待されるだろうと思いますから。
And you're going to get it.
これからまた
That makes us imperialists?
それが我々を
Capitalistic imperialists?
要するにその独占、帝国主義者になるわけですから。
And the Soviet Union puts a wall
そして
up
今度はソ連は壁を作り上げる。
to keep their people in
そしてその人たちをこの封じ込めるためにやって
in
る。
this workers' paradise.
こういうその労働者の天国に封じ込んでる。
And they march into Hungary as they did.
そして彼らがやったようにハンガリーの中に
And you don't call them imperialists?
彼らを帝国主義者というふうに呼ばないわけですから。15年とか
You're talking about the United States 100 years ago.
100年前のアメリカの話じゃないですか。
Well, do you think we stood still?
支配してるんでしょう。運営してるんでしょうかと。
I mean,
もしも政権大統領なかったら誰なんでしょう。
This is a different country.
これはもう変わった国ですよ。
Now, this is not what Marx was talking
マ
about
ルクスが言って
100 years
100
ago.
年前に言ってるような種類の国じゃない。
I mean, that's just gone, that's past
こういう
day.
ことを口にしてるのこれはもう時代遅れだよ。
I mean, we're not run by Governor Rockefeller.
我々は
Bob Kennedy was once asked what was the most important decision of his life. His answer? Marrying Ethel. She was his secret weapon. Her special flair, her charm, her informality, disarmed critics and won friends throughout the world. From a great pope, she brought home rosaries, 7 of them, 1 for each child. In June of 1964, they took their older children with them to Poland. The government did not welcome them, but the Polish people did. Everywhere they went, the young faces from America mirrored the new hopes of a great people. In Germany, it was to visit the Berlin Wall, the world symbol of the free and the non-free. These were the victims of the same battle Robert and John Kennedy had fought at home. These people, too, had given their lives for freedom, for free choice, for human dignity. The grief of the world was symbolized in the face and figure of the man who knew him best. The assassin's bullet had touched him as surely as it had touched his brother. There would be many long and lonely days before the dark apathy of grief would wear away. Until he would say to himself, sorrow is a form of self-pity. We have to go on.
Boy. Yeah.
Boy. Good. Girl. There you go. All right.
I caught you, Daddy. Daddy!
You know, Mike ain't there. You're not supposed to be catching.
Daddy? Daddy? Look, Daddy, this way. Come on.
Run. Throw it. Throw it. Mike, don't drop it, David. I'll kill you. Oh!
I got it.
Robert Kennedy has been a leader not only of men, but of young people. If his life in government has had meaning, it's that we can do something about tomorrow.
Thus, I think our destiny is to rebuild America, the destiny of this generation of Americans, to change the face of this nation, to deal with our problems, to talk about our divisions with candor and truth, to talk about what separates us and what divides us and what's good about the United States and what we can do about it. That's what I ask of you, to make your voices heard, not just in protest, not just being against, but that this country will have a new face. George Bernard Shaw once said, some people see things as they are and say, why? I dream things that never were and say, why not? And I ask you to join me. Thank you.